All right, Shalom. Welcome back to the channel. Folks, this has taken me 3 weeks to get this study out to you, but I got to tell you, it's probably one of the most in-depth studies I've ever put together. Huge revelation. And if I didn't add that other week, that last week that I've just been on another 20 or 30 hours of looking at this, I wouldn't have picked up on the source of where all the confusion starts. You're not going to believe it. So to set the stage, we're going to cover three things. We're talking about the count to Shavuot and the difference between Pentecost and Shavuot. Okay, you've heard me talking about this over and over again. Now is the proofs. Okay, so I'm going to show you two witnesses that I'm bringing on this count. So I'm not the only one that sees this. Then we're going to go over the destruction of the temple. I got an animation that we're going to look at, that I'm going to narrate and go through the sequence of events of the destruction of the temple. And then we're going to superimpose that timeline on when the temple was destroyed. And then on the other end of that, we're going to look at something called Tisha B'Av, or Tish B'Av, which is a time of mourning. It's a 3-week period. Okay. If I would not have found this source, this would still be a mystery, but I figured it out. And so this presentation is not going to be a short one. If you can't handle long videos, pause the video at some point, come back and watch the rest of it. Have it in little pieces, digest little pieces at a time. Otherwise, I just get some popcorn, something to drink, sit down and get comfortable, because we got a little ride to go on. Okay. We've been lied to so much, and we've adopted so much man-made tradition that we don't even know. But when you start looking at all the proofs, things starting to line up in a different way. And my prayer is that you see that in this presentation. So without any further ado, I'm going to get right into it with my two witnesses that I have on this count, you guys. Remember, I've been telling you this longer than 50 days. One reason is because at 50 days, we don't have either wheat or new wine. We got two witnesses in that. Okay. And then what's on the other end of it, when you do the correct count and you see what happens there, I think you'll understand why it was changed. Okay. So let's get right into it. Hang tight.
Using the lunar solar calendar is the sole way to currently count to Pentecost. It is only by using the biblical calendar that all the requirements for reckoning Pentecost can be met. Scripture provides 3 time parameters that must be met in order to correctly count to Pentecost. These are clearly given in Leviticus 23, 15, and 16.
You shall also count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, that you bring the wave sheaf, 7 Sabbaths. They must be complete. Then after the 7th Sabbath, you shall count 50 days.
The 3 requirements as set forth in Scripture are: 1. Start the count on wave sheaf the day after the high Sabbath. 2. 7 Sabbaths must be complete. 3. Number 50 days. 7 Sabbaths complete provides 7 complete weeks, starting on wave sheaf. On the next day after the 7th Sabbath, the count to 50 days begins. Depending upon the number of days in the 3rd month or lunation, this 50 count takes you to either the 28th or 29th of the 4th month. The entire count from wave sheaf is approximately 100 days. The Feast of Weeks revolves around the first fruits of the summer wheat harvest. And because wheat calls for 100 to 120 days to mature, the entire process constitutes just about 4 months.
The great feature of the celebration, Feast of Weeks, was the presentation of 2 loaves made from the first fruits of the wheat harvest.
Not of barley.
Joshua alluded
Wheat.
to this truth when he made this statement shortly after the Passover.
Do you not say, there are still 4 months, and then comes the harvest?
Historians and biblical scholars all agree. The Feast of Weeks stands as a memorial of the giving of the law at Mount Sinai.
The day of Pentecost was kept by the Jews also as a festival to commemorate the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. The Feast of Weeks was held in remembrance of the giving of the law. Feast of Pentecost, or of Weeks, when the first fruits, especially of wheat, were presented, commemorative also of the giving of the law on Mount Sinai.
If one were simply to count 50 days from the wave sheaf offering during unleavened bread, then Pentecost would be celebrated well before the children of Israel had even reached Sinai. However, in using the lunisolar calendar, we see the timeline laid out in Scripture, proving the biblical and historical account of Pentecost is indeed a memorial for the giving of the law. Counting 7 Sabbaths complete will always fall on the 8th day of the 3rd month. Exodus 19:1 states, the children of Israel arrived on the same day of the month they had left Egypt, the 15th. Here we have the first 7 days in our count to 50. Exodus 19:10-16 states Yahuwah told Moses to sanctify the people. 3 days later, Yahuwah descended upon Mount Sinai. And so we have 3 more days added to the count, giving us a total of 10 days. In Exodus 24, Yahuwah asks Moses to come up the mountain together with the elders. Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and the elders then ascended Mount Sinai. Yahuwah then calls Moses into the mountain. After 40 days, Moses descends with the original tables of stone written by the finger of Yahuwah. This, adding 40 more days, gives us a total of 50 days. Further proof shows us on the 49th day of our count. Exodus 32 tells us that Aaron proclaims, "Tomorrow is a feast to Yahuwah." Being the high priest appointed by Yahuwah himself, Aaron had beheld Yahuwah's presence on the paved work of sapphire stone in Exodus 24. And so, therefore, this was no random feast, albeit the children of Israel desecrated this sacred day with their idolatrous behavior. It was the Feast of Weeks, found exactly 50 days after the 7 Sabbaths complete on the lunisolar calendar. Only by counting 7 complete Sabbaths on the lunisolar calendar, then adding another 50 days, does one arrive at the true Feast of Weeks, that is, Pentecost. Far from disproving lunar Sabbaths and the lunisolar calendar system, the biblical count to the Feast of Weeks is one of the most remarkable verifications of the exactitude of both.
Welcome back to the channel, you guys. Jonathan here. I want to continue the study that we've been in. I just found something. Well, I got this in a playlist, but I realized that Matthew had some really good graphics, but on what I was talking about last time, and I'm pretty. I don't know if I did a really good job explaining this count up to Shavuot. And because there's a number of ways that people do it, and so it is very confusing. My approach is a more practical approach based off of why the count is, and it has a lot to do, well, it has everything to do with the grain. And my point has been that at 50 days, the only grain that you got is barley that's ready to go.
And there's no new
I
wine.
found some interesting things about the destruction of the temple and the timing of all this very season that we're in right now, and the destruction of the temple. And I believe that I have figured out why the rabbis changed things the way they did. And it's horrifying, actually, what they went through in the destruction of the temple. But before we get there, and I got some really good graphics and some animation on that. I love visuals, and that's why I'm using Matthew here. Not only that, but he's also such a really good teacher. Does a superb job of explaining things very clearly. I get excited. Sometimes I misspeak. Sometimes I'll leave things out and then record the whole video and realize I meant to say something. He has already put this together, and so we're going to start. Now, the video we're going to look at here is just a part of it, because he's speaking to a specific group of people, which is this lunar Sabbath people. Because even among our community, there's a number of ways that people doing things. I've told you that before, like the new moon is the full moon people, which do things 2 weeks differently than we do. Then there's the conjunction people, right? They keep new moon at conjunction. And there's a keep it at the first visible crescent, right? So we're all over the place just like everybody else, right? So, like I said in the last video about focusing and getting in one mind and one accord, right? So Matthew's explaining to this group the way you can, the different ways of numbering 50. And what he came to, which was it should be a longer count, which is, the big reason why I'm using this, because he's a witness to me, you guys. There's other people that see the same thing I do. And this is not, learning from another guy, something that didn't. That's not why I'm sharing his stuff. I didn't learn all this from Matthew. He's been a confirmation. It's been like lockstep. I can see the same thing, and then I see his video, and it's like huge confirmation to me. So he has spent a lot of time putting these things together. All credit to him. You guys go and subscribe to his channel, Ministers of the Covenant. One of the best teachers out there on the calendar. And like I said, I only just share a portion of this with you, because we're going to bring home a point here at the end of this presentation on the destruction of the temple, the timing of that. And it's a lot of detail. So this would have taken me weeks to put all of these charts and stuff together. And we are in this season now. So right off the bat, I want to show you like this visual of the 3-month period, Abib, Zeb, and Savan, right? So if you recall, when we talked about Abib 14, which is Preparation Day, it's the day of the crucifixion, okay? Yeshua's in the tomb. It's a Sabbath. 15th is always a Sabbath. The wave sheaf offering would be the 16th, Resurrection Day, first fruits, right? And then the count all the way down. If you just did a straight 50, or just count 50, you're going to come to Savan 9. Okay, so he's explaining to the different groups. I'm trying to find a point where he just goes into, 7 Sabbaths complete, and then numbering the 50 all the way up into the day that I'm hoping you guys can see is the real day that the law was given. This is carrying off the last video I just put out, right? That day was desecrated. It was a feast unto Yah. I see the very same thing. It was desecrated, but it also plays a role in the timing of when the temple was destroyed. I'm going to try to put all that together for you, but you got to see this, okay? The timing of this is critical.
As a working day, or even we keep it as a Sabbath.
I was talking about new moon here, but we're getting past that to what he's about to say.
Option number two, we start with 8 of 16, we count 7 Sabbaths. It always yields Pentecost on the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, which is Sivan the night. If we keep Sivan the night as a Sabbath, which Pentecost is a Sabbath, it's a holy convocation of servile work, right? Offering of offerings. Can we also count it then as a work day? Lunar Sabbatarianism often makes the point that you cannot count the Sabbath or new moon as a working day. And I think that's a legitimate point. For instance,
I don't know why we get all blurry like that.
know that the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, is never counted as a working day, right? It's not one of the 6 working days. And I think Ezekiel 46, verse 1 and 3 mentions the new moon right with the Sabbath. Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, the gate of the inner court that looketh toward the east shall be shut the 6 working days, one category. But on the Sabbath it shall be open, second category. And a lot of people stop right there. Then it says, and on the day of the new moon it shall be open. See,
And by the way, you guys, we are looking at the this would be the lunar solar calendar. Okay, so Abib, Zip, Savan, and so we are in the 3rd month, and that's when people are coming to the end of their counting the Omer, whether it's the Jews counting the Omer or Christians counting the Omers or lunar Sabbatarians. This is what our calendar looks like with the new moon in blue, whether it's a 1 day or a 2 day, and then the 8, 15, 22, 29, right? That's what it looks like. We're not talking about the Zadok calendar. We're talking about the lunar solar. I just want to be really clear on that, so we're no confusion. We are counting
the new moon is separated from the 6 working days. That doesn't mean, brothers and sisters, that doesn't mean the new moon is the Sabbath. People confuse what we believe all the time. They say, well, you believe the new moon is the Sabbath, and I tell them, no, I don't. And then they still tell me, yes, you do. And I say, no, I don't. Please listen to what I'm saying. I believe it's the new moon, not the Sabbath. It's separated from the Sabbath, just like it's separated from the working days. There's not the same restrictions on the new moon as there are on the Sabbath. It doesn't mean, though, that the new moon is not a special day. The new moon is still a special day. It's a holy day, set apart day. It's different than the 6 working days. And we always make the point that if we're not going to count the Sabbath as a working day, that is the weekly Sabbath, then we also should not count the new moon as a working day. That's why our count stops at the new moon and starts after the new moon. All right. Leviticus 23, verse 21 says this, and you shall proclaim on the selfsame day that it may be a holy convocation unto you. You shall do no servile work therein. It shall be a statute forever in all your dwellings throughout your generation. That's Pentecost. That's the feast right there.
To those that are on that particular count, that's what he's saying. So that he's not saying this is the literal on this count right here. Okay, so they stop here, which is the first day of the week. Even though they got Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, that's a Saturday here. It wouldn't be like that every month. Every Saturday is not going to line up with our calendar, you guys. For this particular layout, he's got it so the Saturday Sabbatarians can see the conundrum they have with the count with fixed days. I guess that's why he's got that there anyway.
Just 23:9 through 21. So Shavuot or Pentecost, Shavuot is the Hebrew name, right, centering in on the weeks. Pentecost is the Greek name, centering in on the number 50. If Shavuot or Pentecost is a Sabbath, a holy convocation, a day when we are not allowed to do all our work. Remember what Exodus 20 says in the 10 Commandments? 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. Well, if Pentecost is a day that you cannot do all thy work, then it's a Sabbath. Are we then authorized to count it both as a Sabbath and a work day? If we say yes, then it seems to me that we could count through the new moon as well. Let me give you an example here. Here we have Sivan the 8th. That's the 7th Sabbath in the lunar Sabbatarian count of Pentecost. The day after the 8th is the 9th. That's the day that option 2 of this sermon celebrates the feast. Now, would then the next Sabbath land on the 15th? That's when it would normally land. But But if you say that the 15th is a Sabbath, then that means you didn't only count 7 on the 9th.
And by the way, let me just point out, folks, like the video we saw, the last one with says that we're waving barley up here, but down here, 50 days later, right, we're harvesting that same grain. That's what he says in there. Where does he get this tradition, right? Well, and because they're only counting 50 now, and it wasn't always like that. That's my point, you guys. I don't believe the Hebrews were always doing it like that because they were keeping it according to the grain. But there's something happened, especially at the destruction of the temple, that was specific to the grain, you guys. This is something I just recently discovered, but by going through hours and hours of lectures and Josephus and a lot of stuff. There's something specific that happened with the barley and the wheat in the destruction of the temple. And I think it has something to do why they count Omers. There's no longer a Shavuot the way the Bible says it is. It's a different thing. We're only counting 50. And by the way, they're counting Omers. It's like 49 steps of light or something like that in Kabbalah, right? It's not what you think. It's not, has nothing to do with grain anymore. Even though you've seen in the video where he says, and at this time, we're baking barley and making bread out of it. No, that is not what Shavuot's about. It's not, well, in the destruction of the temple, it was the only bread available. I'm going to get to that. Don't want to spoil it. Don't want to spoil it for you. But let's get through this. In this count, this is where they're stopping it, right here. And by the way, this is in the time where you can have, you can harvest barley at that point. It's golden at this point. Or it's turning golden. It's probably going to have a couple more weeks still to go. But definitely no wheat at that point. Okay?
As a Sabbath. You also counted it as day 1 of your work week. Now, to me, I don't think it makes scriptural sense. Now, somebody asked me the other day, they said, well, Brother Matthew, what about Yom Kippur? What about the Day of Atonement? It is true that in the 7th month, and you go back and read this, I want to challenge you, go back and read Leviticus 23. In the 7th month, we have the day of the new moon, that is Yom Teruah, right? The day of shoutings, day of jubilation. And then we work 6 days and we rest the 7th, that's the 8th day of the moon. Then we work 1 day on the 9th, but we have a commandment to not work and to fast on the 10th. And some people in lunar Sabbatarian theology think that back from the 8th, you count 6 work days, and that's why you keep the 15th. But that's not why you keep the 15th. The 15th day of the 7th month is not a 7th-day Sabbath. It can't be, because it's not preceded by 6 work days. The reason we keep the 15th is because if you read Leviticus 23, Yahweh commands you to stop work on the 15th. It's not in the count of 7 from the 8th, because you stopped on Day of Atonement at the 10th. You catch that? So you work on the 9th, you stop work on the 10th, and then you work 4 more days, 11, 12, 13, and 14, and you keep the 15th. Not because you counted from the 8th, but because Yahweh commands you to keep the 15th. Then your count of 6 starts again. So, Saturday Sabbatarians say this: lunar Sabbaths can't be right because it doesn't align with Pentecost. Sometimes people don't even study lunar Sabbaths because they say it won't align with Pentecost. It's not correct. Once again, I want to go back to the first part about a little bit of dishonesty on their part, I think, or either maybe it just slipped their mind about option number 1. But what I say, what we can say is this: lunar Sabbatarians say the way you count the Pentecost can't be right because it doesn't align with keeping the Sabbath by the heavenly lights. So it can go both ways. If they say, well, lunar Sabbaths can't be right because it doesn't line up with Pentecost, we can say, well, your Pentecost can't be right because it doesn't line up with lunar Sabbaths. You see, we're not going to get anywhere arguing like that. All right? Saturday Sabbatarians need to be reminded that there is a discrepancy over how to begin the count in their own midst. There is. We covered this in parts 1 and 2. Lunar Sabbatarians can accept both the Masoretic Hebrew text, which aligns with the Dead Sea Scrolls, as well as the Greek Septuagint when it comes to beginning the count. If you remember in part 1, we harmonized those two texts, and we understand that both texts are talking about the same day when it comes to beginning the count, Abib the 16th. But with Saturday Sabbatarian theology, there's a discrepancy from the Greek Septuagint and the Hebrew Masoretic text. One count starts from the 16th of Abib, the other count starts on the Saturday Sabbath that falls within the Feast of Unleavened Bread. One of them discredits the Septuagint, the other one discredits the Masoretic text. We as Lunar Sabbatarians say we accept both of them. We always must remind them that in their methodology, they have a discrepancy over how to begin the count. They want to always remind us that we have a supposed discrepancy on how to end the count. Let's not let them forget the discrepancy on how to begin the count. Option number 2 continued a little bit more. Bear with me. This will be a quick one. If we count in this way, the second option of starting with Abib 16th, 7 lunar Sabbaths, landing on Sivan the 9th, the 50th day, Pentecost will always follow the same day of the month, Sivan the 9th, without exception. It seems that the counting process is in place because the feast can land on various days. What I mean is this, is that all the other pilgrim feasts of Yahweh are given set days of the moon. Pentecost, though, is not. You have to count for Pentecost.
And the reason for that, and I tried to explain this, and I think Joey Thompson mentioned something on the last video about that day in the cycle, the 19-year cycle. Listen, that's going to fluctuate one day between one day. One year it'll be the conjunction, and another year it'll be the sliver. So that's why you have to count. It's not set in there. You have to count that. That's a really good point, and that's why you do. You can't just set the day because it has a lot to do with the moon. This doesn't. Right here, going right here doesn't. But it's got everything to do with the grain too, which is determined by the sun and the moon. All the crops go by the sun and the moon, and this is what the new moon to new moon and Sabbath to Sabbath means. It all lines up. The new moon lines up with all the Sabbaths every month. And whatever day the new moon falls on, whether it's a Saturday or a Thursday or Tuesday, the rest of the month is going to be that same day. It's not going to be Saturday every month, right? It just looks like that on the way he's got it laid out here. Because, anyway, that might be a little confusing up there to some people. But anyway, let's continue.
I didn't understand again on this. You be the judge. But it seems to me that the reason this feast is counted to is because it doesn't always land on the same day. Option number 3 for Lunar Sabbatarians is it is possible that Leviticus 23, 15 through 16 might be understood as counting 7 Sabbaths and then numbering 50 days. Now, in our minds, we think 7 Sabbaths, 7 times 7, 49, 50 times 7, 49, that makes sense. And it does, doesn't it? It makes a lot of sense. But when we understand that that only works if the Sabbath we keep is by the calendar of man, then what we ought to do is say this. We must not be understanding something right because we know that Yahweh's Sabbath is reckoned by the heavenly lights. So let's pull from that hitching post. And let's go back to Leviticus 23 and see if there's another way that we could understand the count of Pentecost. Leviticus 23, 15 through 16, King James Version says, "And he shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. Even unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath shall ye number 50 days. And you shall offer a new meat offering unto the Lord," or unto Yahweh, it's supposed to say. So for the sake of argument, let's say that this text could be understood either way. I'm willing to grant that to the argument, okay? Let's say that this text could go either way. Let's say it could be saying that even from the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, you shall number day 50. Let's say you can understand it like that. Or it could be saying, even up until the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, 7 Sabbaths and then 50 days, which is how we arrived at the day that we're at now. I can see how you can understand the command to be to count either way. So, is there anything else in Scripture that would lead us in either direction? In other words, if we argue about this text and we go back and forth with Saturday Sabbatarians, is there anything else? Is there any other evidence in Scripture that would lead us in the direction of an earlier feast or a later feast? A third month feast, which if you count it with just the 50 days there, 7 Sabbaths and then 1 day, you'll always end up right at the beginning of the third month. If you count it like we've counted it, and we're here today, you'll always end up at the end of the fourth month, scriptural month. So we want to go to Exhibit A, and Exhibit A is Exodus 19.
This is what I tried to convey in the last video, and
It states this.
I might have messed up doing it.
In the third month, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt.
And what I mean by messed up is not been very clear on, the same day. We're talking about the middle of the month, whether it's the 16th or the 15th. That's only a day. We're talking about the middle of the month and the timing of that, because we're going to be looking at 40 days and 40 nights, and where that puts us back down the mountain when the law is given. It's a specific time. It's and guess what? From month to month, we don't know when the new moon is. Just like on the 7th month when we got to declare Yom Teruah, you have to cite the moon, right? It's the same every month where we have to cite the new moon. And so you don't know on the other end of your count, when you're counting the numbering the 50, if it's going to be a 1 day or 2 day new moon. You follow, right? So it could land on conjunction, or it can land on the first sliver. And sometimes it does oscillate. It doesn't always fall on the conjunction. So I wanted to be clear on that. That's for you, brother Joey Thompson.
The same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai. I pulled my daughter Morgan to the side yesterday, and I asked her, I said, honey, let's read this text. She read it. We read Exodus 19:1. And I said, what do you think the same day is referring to? In other words, when it says the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai, the same day as what? And she read it, and she said, it seems like from that verse, and this is a direct quote, it seems like from that verse, Dad, that it's saying the same day that they left the land of Egypt, they came to the wilderness of Sinai. End of that quote from Morgan. I think she's right. I think she's correct. I think it's saying that they came to the wilderness of Sinai on the same day that they were gone forth out of the land of Egypt. I think that's what it's saying. Now, Adam Clark, his commentary on the Bible, explains that there's 3 options for the understanding of the same day. Let's go over these options here. Option number 1, Adam Clark says, the same day means the same day of the third month, with that the 15th, on which the Israelites had left Egypt. Option number 2, he says, the same day signifies here a day of the same number with the month to which it is applied, the third day of the month. In other words, it's the third month, and the same day means the same number as the month. You can see that option right there. I can see what the judge said there. Okay. And then he gives a third option, and he says this is the one he believes. He says, by the same day, the first day of the month is intended. The Jews celebrate the Feast of Pentecost 50 days after Passover. From the departure out of Egypt to the coming of Sinai were 45 days. On the second day of this third month, Moses went up into the mountain, and 3 days were given to the people to purify themselves. This gives the 4th day of the third month, or the 49th, from the departure out of Egypt. On the next day, which was the 50th from the celebration of Passover, the glory of God appeared on the mount, in commemoration of which the Jews celebrate the Feast of Pentecost. End of that portion from Adam Clark. And he's right. Rabbinic Judaism keeps Pentecost 50 days after Passover. Why? They don't count 7 Sabbaths. They just count 7 periods of 7. They count straight 50 days. Okay. He goes on in his commentary to mention the word month is Chodesh in Hebrew. And he talks about how that it can signify new moon. And, we know that it can. but it can also just refer to a month in general, can it? Depends on the context of the passage. So it could be talking about the same day of the month that they left the land of Egypt. So we read it again. It says, in the third month, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai. Now, remember that Adam Clark takes the third option, that is the first day of the month, because it aligns with the way rabbinic Judaism counts to Pentecost. But if we allow the verse to speak for itself, we see that the children of Israel did not even arrive at Sinai until the middle of the third month. Why do I say that? Because they left Egypt in the middle of the first month. All right. So if they left Egypt in the middle of the first month, that means they arrived at the wilderness of Sinai in the middle of the third month. The reason that that's problematic for the regular way that Pentecost is counted here by rabbinic Judaism is because Pentecost has always been associated with the giving of the law. The feasts, the three major feasts, are agricultural, right? The first one has to do with barley, the second with wheat, and the last one, the Feast of Tabernacles, has to do with everything else, apple trees, figs, etc. Okay? However, they also commemorate great events in the history of the Israelite people. In other words, they're not just agricultural feasts. They commemorate things. We know this. Passover commemorates Exodus 12, right? Tabernacles commemorates dwelling in booths. Unleavened bread commemorates not having time for the dough to rise, right? They commemorate things. Pentecost, everybody understands Pentecost is around the time that the law was given. But this is problematic. This is problematic because Exodus 19 and 1 says the children of Israel didn't even get to the wilderness of Sinai until the middle of the third month, the same day that they left Egypt. Why is it problematic? All of the counts to Pentecost, the early counts, all end up before the middle of the third month. And they associate that with the giving of the law. But the law was not given, according to Exodus 19 and 1, at the beginning of the third month. It couldn't have been. They did not even arrive in the wilderness of Sinai until the middle of the third month. This is why this is Exhibit A. It's important that you understand this. So we go to the next chart, and I'll bring up Exhibit B. This is Exodus 24 and 12.
And so that was a good point. I don't even think I brought that up the last time. And Matthew's doing a superb job here of laying this out.
Exodus 31 and 18. I've got these on the screen. Exodus 24 and 12 says, and Yahweh said unto Moses, come up to me into the mount and be there, and I will give thee tables of stone and the law and commandments which I have written, that thou mayest teach them. So notice, Moses is told in Exodus 24 to come up to Yahweh, and Yahweh will do what? Give him a law and tablets of stone. Now, Exodus 24 comes after Exodus 20. Does anybody know what Exodus 20 is? 10 Commandments. The law was spoken by Yahweh.
Spoken. He came down.
It says in Exodus 24, 4 chapters later, come up to me and I will do what? I will give you the law.
So that's when Moses goes up, and that's what I was trying to convey to you guys. And I know I was blowing through all those chapters and stuff. Matthew just lays out the ones that I should have just had on the screen in the first place. And so you can see there's a difference between Yah coming down and you know, and there are times where Moses doesn't go all the way up. He comes up to a plateau. That's where the 70 elders are. And he goes up even further when he goes on up, right? So when he has Joshua with him, and he's got the rest of it, the elders, they're all right there on that plateau. It's not all the way up on top of the mountain. He goes up even further. So this is when he officially goes up and gets the tablets of stone, right? So this is where we're talking about. And he's up there for 40 days and 40 nights. So the law hasn't even come down yet. We only got an oral. We only got, you know, verbal warnings, right? With some details. That's what he gives them. And by the way, had he not done that, and Moses just went up and he got the law, and he comes down and he sees what they're doing, Moses wouldn't have an argument because they wouldn't have known what the law was. And one of the last things that Yah says to them is don't make any idols of gold and silver of me. Right? And they do that thing. And not only that, Aaron knew that there was a feast coming up because he knew the count that he was supposed to keep, even though they weren't in the land yet, right? He knew when the count was. And he said, let there be a feast unto Yah. And then Moses comes down and sees what they're doing on the feast day, which was the next day. I said, there's a difference. When you do the count all the way up, and because we're going to see it's 40 days and 40 nights. We know they've been here, to the early part of the third month. And then when you continue the count, where does it take you? It takes you where I told you, which is significant to the destruction of the temple. The temple was destroyed. Oh, I don't want to spoil it for you. We gotta get through this. We gotta get through this, guys.
Exodus 31:18 says this, and he, speaking of Yahweh, gave unto Moses, when he had made an end of communing with him upon Mount Sinai, 2 tables of testimony, tables of stone, written with the finger of God. When did Yahweh give Moses the 2 tables of stone? When he had made an end of communing with Moses. And Deuteronomy 9 verse 11 says this, and it came to pass at the end of 40 days and 40 nights, which is a reference to what? The fast of Moses, right? At the end of that, Yahweh gave me, Moses says, the 2 tables of stone, even the tables of the covenant. So in Exodus 20, Moses is not with Yahweh yet. Yahweh speaks the law in Exodus 20, 21, 22, and 23. Then in Exodus 24, Yahweh says, Moses, you come up to me, and I'll give you this law. I'll give you the tablets of stone that I have written with my very own finger. Now, in Exodus 19, verse 1, what we covered just a few minutes ago, is to be understood as teaching the middle of the third month. Then we have Moses being told to come up to the mount by Yahweh in Exodus 24, verse 12, late in the third month or after the middle of the month. Now, according to Exodus chapter 19, verses 10 through 11, this is before the 10 commandments are uttered. It says, and Yahweh said unto Moses, go unto the people and sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes, and be ready against the third day. For the third day Yahweh will come down on the side of all the people upon Mount Sinai. Now remember, this is after Exodus 19, verse 1. Verse 1 says they came to the wilderness of Sinai the same day that they left Egypt. All right, that's the middle of the third month. And then in Exodus 19, verse 10, because Yahweh's fixing to utter some laws, he says, you sanctify the people today, tomorrow, and let them be ready on the third day. And I'm going to say that's the 17th. And then we have Exodus 24, verse 4. I'm going to turn over there. Exodus 24, verse 4. No time elapses from Exodus 19:11 all the way to Exodus 24. Yahweh speaks all of that on that day. You can read it in your Bible study time. In Exodus 24, verse 4, it says, and Moses wrote all the words of Yahweh, and rose up early in the morning, and built an altar unto the hill, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. So early in the morning gives us another day, which would be Sivan, the 18th. All right, then we have Exodus 24, 12 through 18. Let's read that. Exodus 24, verse 12, and Yahweh said unto Moses, come up to me into the mount and be there. And I will give thee tables of stone, and the law, and commandments which I have written, that thou mayest teach thee. And Moses rose up, and his minister Joshua, and Moses went up into the mount of God. And he said unto the elders, tarry ye here for us until we come again unto you.
That's at the plateau.
Aaron and Hur are with you. If any man have any matters to do, let him come unto them. And Moses went up into the mount. Verse 15, that's when he goes up into the mount. That's when the 40 days and 40 nights begins. The fast, he goes up into the mount. And a cloud covered the mount. And the first part of that 40-day fast, look what happened in verse 16. And the glory of Yahweh abode upon Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. And the 7th day he called unto Moses out of the midst of the cloud. And the sight of the glory of Yahweh was like devouring fire on the top of the mount in the eyes of the children of Israel. And Moses went into the midst of the cloud and gat him up into the mount. Good King James English there. And Moses was in the mount 40 days and 40 nights. And notice, he went into the mount back in verse 15. So he was there for 40 days and 40 nights. And at the end, according to Exodus 24:12, 31:18, Deuteronomy 9:11, at the end of that, Yahweh gave Moses tables of stone that he had written himself. And what was on those tables of stone? The law, the Torah, was on those tables of stone. Here we have a chart depicting this in calendar format. We've got the third month right here. We've got the 15th day of the third month represented in Exodus 19:1. All right. Then we have sanctify yourself today, tomorrow. Be ready against the third day. All right. Exodus 19:10 through 11. Then we have Exodus 24:4, where it says Moses got up early in the morning, built the pillars, remember, for the 12 tribes of Israel. One pillar for each tribe. That was his first day in the mount. Day 2, day 3, 4, 5, 6, and on the 7th day, Yahweh's a devouring fire, Exodus 24:16. And then we continue to count through the third month of Sivan. So if this chart is anywhere close to accurate, and I believe that it is, it might be configured and fine-tuned later on. Moses didn't go up into the mount until Sivan the 18th. And then he was with Yahweh 40 days and 40 nights before Yahweh gave him the law and commandments. And this will be at the end of the fourth month when the law was actually given to Moses, which aligns better with numbering 50 days after the seventh Sabbath in Leviticus 23:15 through 16.
And you know what else it lines up with? When you go another 50 days, all right, so at 50 days, you're going to have barley that's ready to be harvested. Another 50 days, it's time to start the wheat harvest, right? So you're harvesting just enough to make flour and make bread. You're not harvesting the whole thing, right? So you would harvest enough, and then the harvest would continue all summer long, right? Because they would be harvesting wheat all summer long. This was the crop that would feed the people. The barley was to feed the animals. Okay, that's really important to understand, because when they're in the temple and the siege is underway and all this is playing out toward the end of the fourth month, right? The very same season that we're in now, the siege is going on. There's wheat out in the fields that's still green at 50 days. It hasn't started to ripen yet. 50 days later, it's golden. You can start harvesting it, right? So when they're in the temple and the siege is going, or in Jerusalem, in the walls, Romans are out with the wheat field. They didn't destroy the wheat, by the way. They just took control of it. So the Jews had no wheat in this season. In the very last AD 70 was the worst festival year on record for the Jews. Starting at Passover, because that's when Titus gets to Jerusalem, was the 14th of Nisan, right at the Passover. And the city was flooded with Hebrews from all over the place, and they were trapped in the city. And so they didn't have, all they had in there was, some barley, right? But when you look at the count and you look at how the calendar is, and we know when the temple was destroyed, exactly what day, and what led up to that, it's all in this time, you guys. This is very profound, and this is a big reason why the Jews have changed things. I'm telling you, I'm not crazy, right? So we still have to have wheat.
Not given to Moses until that he had fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. So it appears from Exhibit A, Exodus 19:1, and Exhibit B, these other three texts that I read, that these other scriptures that we're looking at, these first two exhibits, these other scriptures we're looking at, align with keeping Pentecost later in the year, late in the fourth month, rather than early in the third month. Exodus 31:18 says, and he gave unto Moses, when he had made an end of communing with him upon Mount Sinai, 2 tables of testimony, tables of stone, written with the finger of God. When did Yahweh give him this? When he made an end of communing with him, at the end of his fast. 32 verse 1. And when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, what does that mean? Well, he's been up there for 40 days. He's delayed. Where's Moses? Where's the man of Elohim at? What happens? The people gathered themselves together unto Aaron and said unto him, Up, make us gods, which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what is become of him. And Aaron said unto them, Break off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives and your sons and of your daughters, and bring them unto me. And all the people brake off the golden earrings which were in their ears, and brought them to Aaron. Verse 4, and he received them at their hand, and fashioned it with a graving tool, after he had made it a molten calf. And they said, These be thy gods, or literally thy God, should say. Some translations say God singular, and that's what it should read, because there was only one calf that was made. O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. Verse 5, and when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made proclamation and said, Tomorrow is the feast to Yahweh.
All right, the next day.
And read further down in that passage.
Now, let me just say this: if we look at what the calendar looks like and where he is, I'm going to use mine. Because this is universal. All right. So he's counting the fourth month, and this is where we end up. We end up down toward the end of the month, which is, coming up on New Moon Day. We're at New Moon time at the end of the count, by the way. Now, every month that is a feast day. It's not like a Sabbath feast or like a hog, but this particular one is the one that we land on our account, and it's going to be either conjunction or the crescent, depending on the year. Anyway, it's new moon time. All right, that's important that we know that the moon is in a hidden state, right? So it's not full moon time. It's a new moon time every time, and it could alternate from year to year, from total conjunction or a sliver. Okay.
I want you to remember, Exodus 31:18 shows that Moses received the law from Yahweh after the 3-day fast. Notice what happens here. We're late in the fourth month. It must be noted that a very technical Hebrew word is used in verse 5, and that's the word hog. This word hog is translated as feast right here in Exodus 32, verse 5. It's a very technical term. This Hebrew word has reference to the pilgrim feast of Israel, where the Israelites would take a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, Israel, to celebrate the feasts.
That's why it's critical that you understand all this is taking place when the destruction of the temple's going on. We're in this time, folks, the very time that they were doing, and not only once, twice. Both temples were destroyed at the same time, not the same week. Many hundreds of years separated. First by Nebuchadnezzar, and then by the Romans. Okay. So, but it was the same day, okay? And then this happened on that same day. Do you follow what I'm saying?
First feasts were not pilgrimages, obviously. The first Passover, they had pilgrim, right?
Let me clarify. I should clarify. They were. You're going to see in the animation that I got for you under the siege that it was like a few days. So it was at new moon time when they had breached the wall and come into the courtyard. They're killing. They're still doing sacrifices in the temple, inside the temple. They were running out of supplies. They run out of everything. There was no wheat at this time at 102 days. There was no wheat. All they had was some barley, and some hay. That was all they had, and they were eating.
No wheat inside the city is what I mean by that. There was wheat on the outside that the Romans controlled, as you'll see in the animation. But the only thing they had on the inside after the siege started was the barley. And then after the wall was built to keep them from going outside and foraging, they couldn't get anything. So that would include wheat, new wine, anything in the summer fruit basket, right? Like in Amos 8, they couldn't get any of that.
Well, I don't want to get into it, but this is the timing of it, you guys. The hog. And so in the time of Jerusalem, they were on this day, this very day that the molten calf was. I'm telling you, at 102 days is exactly when, because like 7 days later, or excuse me, 10 days later, depending on who you ask. Some say it's the 7th, some say it's the 10th. It's not the 9th, that's for sure. That's a rabbinic tradition. You kind of split the difference, I guess. But it was just the next week after the Shavuot that the temple was destroyed. Less than that. They didn't even get one cycle of one more Shabbat in there. That was it. It was done. And then the slaughter began. Okay.
Inside the temple.
Really good presentation.
The slaughter inside the gates, inside the temple, and inside the cities where all the people were. That's the slaughter. The slaughter had already started on the outside with the vicious fighting. So,
all right, I got for you guys, but I want to make that point here.
The first meeting that's what this happened. They were in the wilderness for 40 years. But when they came into the land, generally it was understood that Jerusalem was the place that Yahweh put his name. People would journey from all over the land of Canaan to Jerusalem, Israel, to keep the feast. They would make a pilgrimage for the feast. The word Chag refers to these three major feasts in Israel. It's used about 62 times in Hebrew scripture, and each time it refers to one of the three major feasts in Israel, or either a sacrifice associated with one of these three feasts. The only use of the word that seems like an exception at first is found in 1 Kings chapter 12. Now, I do want to turn to this. 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 32 through 33. This is the one use of the word Chag that looks like it's an exception to the rule, where it does not apply to one of the pilgrim feasts of Yahweh. 1 Kings 12, verse 32 says, "And Jeroboam ordained a feast, Chag, in the 8th month, on the 15th day of the month, like unto the feast that is in Judah. And he offered upon the altar, so did he in Bethel, sacrifices unto the calves that he had made. And he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places which he had made. So he offered upon the altar which he had made at Bethel the 15th day of the 8th month, even in the month which he had devised of his own heart, and ordained a feast unto the children of Israel, and he offered upon the altar and burnt incense." Jeroboam had split with Rehoboam. These were two of Solomon's sons. This is when the kingdom of Israel became divided. Primarily the 2 tribes of the south with each other, and the 10 tribes of the north were with each other. Jeroboam ordained this feast, and it was like unto the feast in Judah, which shows us that Jeroboam was over the 10 northern tribes. Rehoboam was over the 2 southern tribes. What does it mean that he ordained a feast like unto the feast that is in Judah? This is what it means. The text says it was the month that he devised in his own heart, not the day. When does the feast happen here, Jeroboam's feast? The 15th day of the 8th month. The day is right. Why? Because it mimics the Feast of Tabernacles. The Judahites were keeping the Feast of Tabernacles on the 15th day of the 7th month, the 7th moon. Jeroboam ordained a feast like Tabernacles in the 8th month. He kept the same day, the 15th, but it was the month he devised in his own heart. In other words, he kept Tabernacles in the 8th month rather than the 7th month. It was a month he devised in his own heart, and it was wrong. It was a sin. If Yahweh says keep it in the 7th month, you don't keep it in the 8th month. Amen. Right? So, even though this word Chag appears on the surface like it's not talking about one of Yahweh's feasts, it actually is. Because he's keeping Yahweh's feast in the wrong month. You see what I'm saying? It's still a pilgrim feast there. And that's the only exception, seeming exception, to the rule. Now, some say, including myself in the past, an argument that I had made and that I see how it was not correct now, is that Exodus 32, and you might be thinking this, you're saying, Brother Matthew, but could Exodus 32 be Yahweh's feast? because of the golden calf incident? Well, yes, and here's why. In Exodus 32, when Aaron proclaimed a vow to Yahweh, he was not ever rebuked or condemned by Yahweh or anybody for the timing of the feast. Jeroboam was. Jeroboam was condemned for the timing of the feast and also for the calves that he made. Aaron was not condemned for the timing, but only for the calf. You see that? You could keep a feast to Yahweh at the right time and incorporate false worship into that feast. You see that? We could get here on Passover, and I could say, you know what, Brother Tim, instead of lamb this year, I think I would like to taste some turkey. And we'll just do away with lamb, and we'll just have a turkey Passover. Well, that will be the animal that Brother Matthew devised in his own heart, right? Because Yahweh said to have lamb at Passover, right? Not turkey. You see that? Just because there was a golden calf there that they were worshiping. And I think personally what was happening was they were trying to make a figure of the God that they served. I believe they were trying to take Yahweh, and in their minds, because they'd come out of Egypt.
I don't think Aaron was doing a vicious thing. In other words, he wasn't doing a malicious thing, or even in his own eyes, I don't think he even thought he was doing a wicked thing. Even though Yah had just told them right before children forget really fast. That's why I said, you could say, don't touch that, and then walk out of the room. That first thing a toddler is going to do is they're going to touch exactly what you said not to touch, right? So that, I think, is a good point that he makes here about it, that he wasn't rebuked for keeping a feast unto Yah, because the timing was right on that, even if it was just the Rosh Chodesh feast, because we're supposed to blow the shofar and celebrate the beginning of every month, right, and have a meal. But this particular one is Shavuot. Shavuot falls on a new moon cycle, on a new moon, or at that time.
All right, we're going to make this calf. It's going to represent our God. It was wrong. It was idolatry. First and second commandment transgression. That doesn't mean the timing of the feast was wrong. When was the timing of this feast? It was late in the fourth month, not early in the third. Here we have another chart. Notice up here at the top of the chart, the 15th, 16th, and 17th represents the 3 days of Exodus 19, 10 through 11. The 18th represents the next morning of Exodus 24, 4, and the day Moses goes into the mount, here on the Savant 18. It begins 40 days and 40 nights. And when we get down to the end of 40 days and 40 nights, the last day of Moses' fast will be on the 28th day of the fourth month, or the fourth moon. When in on the 28th day, what did Aaron say in Exodus 32, verse 5, when Moses still wasn't there? Tomorrow is a call to Yahweh, which places on the day that we're standing in right now, the 29th day of the fourth moon, which is after Moses' 40-day and 40-night fast, and it's also counting 50 days after the seventh Sabbath.
All right, so the way he's got it there on this count, this particular one, it's falling on the 29th day, which is right there at new moon time. So, which will be the one, like this is new moon. That would be the first day of the new month, the Rosh Chodesh. So at the time of Pentecost, we're at a new moon time, right? And then imagine if this was, like I said, the next month is going to be the fifth month, which is the month of Av, when the temple is destroyed. And that's kind of where I'm leading, because there's a pattern here in what they went through during that destruction and what happened here at the mountain. They're worshiping the calf at a holy time that's been defiled. The destruction of the temple. What happened 10 days later? Both the first and the second temple would be 10 days later from the very same holiday, from the very same Hag, right? So in the time of the siege, Titus gets to the outside of Jerusalem on the 14th of Nisan, and that's when it begins. And then it goes all the way up until they breach the walls, and then they come through They fight all the way up. There's, I think, 3 or 4 battles for the temple. And on the fourth one, when it finally burned down and then it was plundered and the slaughter began, they're in the courtroom. Excuse me, the courtyard. You're going to see this in the presentation I got for you. Around the time of Shavuot, that's when the wall was breached, and they come in the courtyard and they're fighting in the courtyard. The very first incursion of the temple, when they breach the wall and come in, it's Shavuot time. So that's when the wall fell. And so we're going to see that, you guys, and what I got for you next in this presentation. Thank you, Matthew Jensen. You guys go and subscribe to the channel. I'll make sure you have a link to this particular one. And by the way, I got a playlist of all 4 of these videos that he does on 7 Sabbaths complete and in 50 days. It's very thorough, very good. He does a great job explaining it. And again, it's another witness to me that I'm going in the right direction with this. I just happen to be seeing other things that can add to this, like the fact that there's no wheat at 50 days. There's only barley. Well,
And there's no new wine either. That's the other thing we get from Acts chapter 2. We know it's Shavuot time, but is there new wine? There has to be new wine if they're being accused of being drunk on new wine. So that's the other witness to the timing of this as well, the new wine.
there's a parallel with the destruction of the temple, at least the second one, the final destruction, where they had no access to the wheat because they were trapped in the city, and the Romans had it. And so they found themselves in a conundrum, especially when the lambs ran out, and they're right there at Passover time when all this started, and they're trapped in the city for 3 months, going into the 4th month when the temple finally is destroyed. It's horrifying. When I was doing a study on that, I just couldn't. I tried. It's being, I have a great way of putting myself in other people's shoes and imagining what things would be like. And when I was looking at that presentation on what Titus did, and the timing of it, and the city was flooded with people coming to the feast, what that did to their morale and what that did to them psychologically, the early Jews, even the early believers of Yeshua, they were keeping the feast still, and they were still coming to the temple to keep the feast as they were supposed to, right? So they would have been in the city. Some may have escaped, but I would imagine a lot of them were slaughtered because the Romans arrived at the same time that they are arriving in the city to celebrate the feast cycle, right? And so bad timing. Like I said, it was the worst feast cycle of any year 70, when the temple was destroyed. And I would think that probably did something psychologically to the rabbis, especially when we look at Tisha B'Av and what the rabbis say about that. And this time of year, by the way, leading up to the destruction and the real Shavuot, a lot of the Orthodox believe it's an unlucky time. It's a bad luck time. Nobody wants to get married at that time. Some won't even travel for like 3 or 4 weeks of that period when the temple was being destroyed. And that's Shavuot time, you guys. So they have this bad taste in their mouth from the destruction of the temple during the wheat harvest, where the wheat harvest is supposed to go on, and the temple is destroyed in that season. So it's not really something like they want to commemorate, right? That would be like, commemorating and celebrating the day that John Kennedy was killed or Martin Luther King was killed. Is that what MLK Day is about? When he died or when he was born? That might be a stupid question, but why would you celebrate when somebody died, right? So usually people celebrate when someone is born. So
I think I have a better analogy that if you could remember back when if you're watching this video, you probably don't anymore, but back when you celebrated Christmas, imagine if your whole family was killed at Christmas time. You probably would not want to celebrate that time of year anymore. So imagine the Jews on a collective scale where it's the worst time ever, right? And this goes on through history, by the way. The ninth of Av, many bad things happened to the Jews all the way down from the destruction of the temple to modern day. It's like the worst time of the year, and it's a time of mourning. There's a point behind this because you can't celebrate a feast where you're supposed to be joyous in a season that you're also mourning. And so we have a conundrum, and I'm leading up to why the day was changed, folks. And I can prove this. I've talked to a number of rabbis, and I know this to be fact, that the day was moved. And that's why they celebrate the end of the barley harvest instead of where it actually is, folks. It has a lot to do with the destruction of the temple and then everything that's happened throughout history in that season. So they have this 3-week season starting at the 17th of Tammuz, going all the way through, which includes Shavuot time. Shavuot is right in the middle of that. So they cannot have a time of mourning and then celebrate a feast of joy and then continue their mourning. They're not going to do that. So the rabbis made a decision to move the day. I hope I didn't spoil it for you. You're going to see my point here when we look at what happens historically, and then I'm going to teach you about Tisha B'Av and how it came about.
It's a bad omen, and Josephus writes about all the bad omens that took place all this time, and the Jews are seeing it. And you don't forget, just a few years prior to that, when Yeshua prophesied about the destruction of the temple, there was a lot of signs that happened that was bad omens, like what happened with the crucifixion and the earthquake that happened and the 3-hour eclipse, and the temple was damaged, and the veil tore. And do you know that they repaired it after that and tried to keep the status quo and keep going? Y'all literally have had to wipe it off the Temple Mount to make his point, and so that had to be very demoralizing and shocking and traumatizing to the early believers, and even the Pharisees, the Sadducees, all of them, the Zealots. Every single one of them had a wake-up call. It was very apparent that Yah had abandoned his temple and Jerusalem. And so what did the faithful ones do down the road? Especially after, imagine, they still had to live all the way up until the time of Constantine. So they did that without a temple. There was no temple all the way up to that. When Constantine finally took over the way of the early believers, and established the Catholic Church, or the Catholic way, right? That's when the calendar was changed, by the way. Up until that point, it was still this calendar right here. And everybody knew that. I got some things to show you in another video. We're going to establish this once and for all. We got some writings from rabbis way back talking about when it all happened, when Hillel did that. And so it's well known to Jews, and I've been telling you guys that. But like I said, when the rabbis decide that Saturday is the Shabbat, guess what? What's done on earth is good in heaven, is what they say, right? So, just to draw the point home, I wanted you to see this, the timing of this, because I see a connection with the destruction of the temple. Remember, when I was trying to figure out why they're counting Omers, and then I figured out, okay, it goes back to the destruction of the temple. So these rabbit holes that I have to go down, and sometimes it yields some nuggets, some things that are enlightening. Like, when I learned from Josephus, the timing of it was right in the middle of the feast season. There was no harvest that year. The Romans got everything. And then leading up to Sukkot in the 7th month, Yom Kippur, and then Sukkot, and that trio was even worse still, right? Because now the temple is completely gone, and people are required to come to Jerusalem again for Sukkot, right? It was horrible. The whole year for them, for the feast season, was bad, right? So, in a way, I can't blame them for changing things and not wanting to remember a certain day. Who would, right? So that's basically strike three. When you messed up at the mountain, and then you messed up and got the first temple destroyed, and then you messed up again and got the second temple destroyed. That's strike three, right? So why celebrate anything in that? We'll change it up a little bit, right? We don't want to remember that day. That's my theory on this, you guys. Is they don't want to go down that road, and so we get man-made traditions. So the siege of Jerusalem. That's what I want to cover next. Well, with you guys in this, and yeah, it's pretty amazing to be able to see the visual of what took place over several months. And the Jews were outnumbered 3-1, which is not real bad odds. It's not good, but it's not bad. And they did a really good job of defending Jerusalem, but they just could not withstand the overwhelming firepower and the equipment that the Romans had. And eventually they fell. And like I said, it must have been really demoralizing. And anyway, visuals, that's up next. This part of the video, we're going to look at the timing of the siege of Jerusalem as it pertains to the calendar, because as I established in the beginning of this video with the count to the real Pentecost, we end up in another place. We end up somewhere right here at the end of the 4th month, which is a new moon time going into the month of Av. Now, let's make note that the 50-day count is going to land you in the month of Sivan, right here. And then, of course, Nisan is where we start our count at Passover time, unleavened bread and first fruits, right? So, just so we have an understanding of the timing of this event I'm about to show you, because we're going to look in detail at the sequence of events and the destruction of the temple. So Titus gets to Jerusalem with his 3 legions, the 10th, the 12th, and the 15th legions, on the 14th day of Nisan, which is Passover. Now we need to
Also known as Abib as well. It doesn't say Abib on here, but you've heard me say Abib, also referencing this day. Nisan and Abib is the same month.
understand the significance of this, because he surely did, and I think Josephus had a lot to do with that. But he understood the significance of the timing of when all this was happening. Even when he put his wall all the way around Jerusalem, and you're going to see this in the animation. The timing of when he did this is around the 3rd month. So they were trapped in the city, or they were trapped and couldn't get out. Up until this point, they could get out and go and get grain. So they could have gone out in the 3rd month and got barley, because remember, barley, the wave sheep offered here, 50 days later, barley's ready to be harvested. It's going to be golden right here. So up until this point, they can get out of the city and get this grain. But once the wall comes up that circles around the whole city, they can't get out and get, which would, 50 days later, what's going to be ready? It's going to be ready for in July, when it's really hot. The wheat's going to be ready. Well, they can't get that, and you're going to see in the animation and what I got to show you here. This causes a problem. That's very significant, and it's very significant to the reason why they don't celebrate Shavuot in the real place.
Among other
this
things.
Is what I'm presenting to you, and I hope you can see that. So let's get on to the presentation I have for you on the sequence of events, and we're going to be looking at a little bit of history. You guys, I hope you love history. This is a really, listen, it's an animation, but there is some bloodshed in there. So if you don't want to see blood and things like that, because it shows battle scenes of battle and things like that, you might want little children not to see that. But for illustration purposes, I think it's excellent to get the point. All right, so here we are with a representation of what Jerusalem would have looked like in the first century. And in particular, the spring of 70 AD. That's what we're talking about. And we're going to look at the 5 months of this siege from this point. I'm only going to start about this point in the video, this original video that I'm going to narrate for you guys. And go through the sequence of events. Of course, here's the temple and the temple compound. This is the east side of Jerusalem. This is the west side, north, and this would be the south down this way. So, interesting things we need to understand: the water supply for a siege. They had plenty of water. They had the Shalom pool, another pool here, Bathsheba, but they also had the Gihon spring that ran through. So they had plenty of water in here. The one thing they needed was food. And the other thing about this whole situation is the number of people that was flooding into the city as 3 Roman legions were approaching in the air, because they arrived at the same time, you guys. That is what is so crazy about this whole thing and what is so tragic. And at this time, there probably were believers of Yeshua that were still keeping the traditions of coming to Jerusalem and keeping the feast. So, and they're more than likely the ones that would have been able to escape. Not everybody escaped this, because once they were in the city, Titus would not let them escape. And it was a slaughter. So let's go through that now. I'm going to try to narrate this for you guys. Bear with me. The infighting that preceded the siege, many of the grain stores have been raided or destroyed by the opposing parties. In addition, the already huge population of Jerusalem had swelled to dangerous levels in the recent weeks with the arrival of pilgrims celebrating Passover. The populace far outnumbered the armed offenders and imposed severe limitations on the length of the supplies could last once the Romans closed in on Jerusalem. The countdown began. Had undergone a long march to reach Jerusalem. Titus recognized that his men were exhausted and ordered that they construct preliminary camps out of range of the city. 12th and the 15th legions, who had arrived from the northeast, began to set up a kilometer away on top of Mount Scopus, with another camp planned for the 5th Macedon, 550 meters further back. As the legions moved into place, Titus rode ahead to personally survey the defenses. On the morning of April 23rd, he set off on April 23rd. He set off. Excuse me. This, this might be a little weird with it, the way it has the closed captioning coming up. 600 horsemen following the road that led to the main gate of the third wall. However, the terrain was uneven and cluttered with gardens, olive groves, and hedges, and fences, walls, and stone structures, which had been knocked down by the defenders. In other words, he walked into a maze of obstacles. All of a sudden, the Jewish forces burst out of the gate and swarmed the Roman column, and cutting in the half of the cavalry in the rear bolted out into the open country that they had come from. Meanwhile, Titus and his escorts were left behind, and the general had neglected to wear his helmet or his breastplate. So it was for the expedition, but nonetheless, he drew his sword and led the charge to break out. According to Josephus, he quoted, he converted those perpetual with his sword that he cut through those who perpetually with his sword that came on his side and overturned many of those that direct met him and made his horse right over those that were overthrown. The encounter was a close call, but ultimately the Romans were able to cut their way through, and they had lost several men and left many injured. Titus was likely shaken by this event and eager to get the siege underway, and he ordered the 10th to move even closer and begin constructing entrenchments atop the Mount of Olives on the east side. That's where they are over here. The Jews were emboldened by their success and decided to follow up with a massive assault sorties. So they come streaming out when the 10th comes over on the Mount of Olives and starts setting up a camp. So, and by the way, the factions that are in here, there's two main factions in Jerusalem. One's led by a Jewish guy named Simon, and the other one's named John. And they're fighting amongst each other when the Romans get there. But when the Romans get there, they band together to fight them off, right? So now we're in a siege, right? And remember, this is during Passover time that this is going on. All this happening when the city is full. They got limited supplies, and they got a feast going on. Okay. Out of the eastern and southern gateways, their sights set on working. Legionary fighter streamed across the Kidron Valley and descended upon the half-built camp of the 10th Praetorians. Romans were caught completely off guard. The Jewish troops started cutting down their disorganized opponents while more rushed out from the city to complete the assault. Titus attacked the flank with his bodyguard, which was enough to force the mob back down the ravine. The 10th resumed, only to come under a second assault from the Jews, who had been steadily bringing in more and more men, and his ferocious attack overwhelmed the Roman force. On the low ground, many of the soldiers fled for the heights, while Titus and a band of troops attempted to hold the line. And the battle went on. As I said, there's a little bit of blood in this, but it's animation. So soon after, the legionaries regrouped and countercharged down the hill, driving the Jews back once more. And the ensuing lull, the camp fortifications were finally completed, and they secured the Roman forward position, but left everyone with a remainder of the strength of the Jewish defense had been dangerously underestimated. In response, Titus now took precautions against further counterattacks, and he posted cavalry divisions to deflect attacks and ordered that the ground between the Roman camps and the walls be cleared. So he cleared all the land, I mean, like all the shrubs, everything from there, a certain amount back. So he's making preparation for siege equipment and siege for the siege to go. They're going to have battering rams and stuff come up, right? Following instruction, this meant cutting down trees, flattening hedges, filling in ditches, and destroying rock projections. This had the dual purpose of removing any cover for the Jewish sorties, as well as preparing the ground for the siege works of the Roman army. It had effectively rolled up its sleeves, and it was time to get to work. All right. So now the siege starts. So they've hardship of attacking from the east. All right, so just to be clear, he recognized that the hardship of attacking from the east because there was a deep ravine on this side, right? So he's gonna want to go over to this side at some point. As a result, he decided to focus on the western flank of the third wall. The 10th Pentecost was left to hold the Mount of Olives while the three remaining legions were redeployed to the backside, 400 meters west of the western gate, while the 12th and the 15th legions established themselves opposite the finest artillery positions were now deployed with their sights set on the city under their covering fire. Each legion began constructing an earth and timber ramp up to the third wall. Jewish projectiles rained down from above, and an attack party slowed the construction at all times of the night and day. However, the concentrated might of the three legions with the artillery support proved to be too much. So you got all these legions that are making breaches on the western side now, right? Can you imagine the Jews on the inside? And they're on the walls. Yeah. It's probably terrifying, especially in the feast of the Lord. And they're shooting projectiles. Raining down on you. And all these people are trapped in there. And now we're under siege. And all this time, there's feast season going on. I mean, this started around Passover time, right? Attackers completed their ramps and soon were slowly rolling battering rams into place. The thudding of the rams signaled progress for the Romans, but also served as a rallying cry for the defenders. The militia units from around the city swarmed into place to pelt the crews and their guards with missiles from above, while raiding parties attacked the engines on foot and from postures and from doors. All right, so missiles they're talking about would be like spears and arrows. Obviously, it's not a missile, but this is what this is what an ancient missile would be. Brutal battle that's going on to try to keep them out, right? But the Romans are very persistent. Very persistent. Brave defenders fought their way up to the rams' protective sheds and were poised to destroy the equipment before Titus led a cavalry attack to drive them off. Amazing graphics, huh? Oh, God. But to get the point, there's a battle going on. They're trying to defend this thing. Ramming was resumed, but Roman engineers built 3 siege towers, which were too heavy to be overturned and which were also fireproofed. These were then rolled into place to provide covering fire support for construction and to clear the area of defenders. Day of the siege. Now think about that. It's been 15 days since they got there, and on the 15th day, the third wall is breached. Okay, so think about that as according to the count that we're doing. Okay, so we haven't got to the 50th day yet. We haven't got to the so-called Pentecost, right? And by the way, we got to have grain for that. Now keep in mind, they're keeping the feast inside the city the whole time, even though there's a battle going on outside. I know it's hard to believe it, but I'm telling you, this is what they're doing, right? They're even doing daily sacrifices. So in the time of Passover, by the way, 250,000 lambs are sacrificed. And then you got daily sacrifices, right? So there's a lot of things going on in the temple. All the while this is going on. So this is 15 days into the siege, right? The third wall is breached. Rams broke through the third wall. They got a hole now, and they're coming through. 15 days in. The Jews yielded the outer city to the Romans and withdrew into the second wall. Titus was eager to keep.
So imagine that, you guys. 15 days into the siege, and now they're inside the city walls, right?
The momentum rolling and established a camp in the heart of the new city, tearing down many structures in the process. The Rams were now brought into position once again and targeted the central tower gate. Within 4 days, a breach was formed. Now think about that. 15 days to get in there. 4 more days. Now think about that according to the count, okay? The legionaries formed up and advanced through the narrow gap. However, they were met with an eerie silence as they came through. Cautiously through the seemingly deserted streets, there was all of a sudden attack from all directions. It was an ambush, right? All of a sudden, the trap was now sprung, and the Jews began unleashing varieties of missiles into the dense infantry clusters. At the same time, hit-and-run parties attacked any exposed troops, but stayed too far from the main body. In shock, the Romans attempted to retreat back through the breach, but found that it was so narrow that only a few men could get through at a time. This choke point was a prime target for the bowmen and slingers. Of the defenders, the Roman archer units were brought up to provide covering fire and eased up enough pressure to allow for the withdrawal. At the same time, however, the Jewish force was mobilized to surge ahead as the Roman tide receded, and they rushed back into the walls, unloading continual barrage into the attackers. Meanwhile, sorties with large blocks of Jews pressed the Romans back while the breach was mended. Josephus recalls the fighting raged all day into the night, and around the tower gate continued by the 4th day. The legions once again broke through this, and Titus ordered that the entire northern stretch of the second wall be torn down and the surrounding towers be manned by Roman forces.
All right, I just want to say right here, when it mentioned Josephus, how Josephus recalls this. Josephus is not in the city, you guys. He is a captured general of Titus, and now by this point is a confidant of Titus, because Josephus had prophesied that Vespasian would be Caesar. So by this point, he's been in captivity for more than 2 years, and he is standing outside. He is literally with Titus on the outside of the walls, watching what is taking place. This is why Josephus is the historian that recorded all this. Titus commissioned him to write about this whole thing. So this is why Josephus is cited in this. Josephus was literally an eyewitness to this whole thing. And not only that, you guys, very similar to the destruction of the first temple. And Jeremiah was a confidant and a prophet. He was a confidant to Nebuchadnezzar after the siege. Okay. Josephus was very similar in that respect, as he was standing on the outside of the gates. And this presentation doesn't address that, but Josephus was outside the gate with Titus and pleaded with the people on the inside to surrender because it was God's will. And they didn't answer him at all. They saw him as a traitor. This is really interesting about Josephus in this respect. But that's an interesting interjection right here, that Josephus would have been on the outside of the walls with Titus. And by the way, Titus gave him his name later, his family name, Flavius. Okay, so Josephus was a confidant of the Romans, recording this whole thing going on.
The Jews now pulled back to the first. All this was part of a deliberate plan to carry out a fighting retreat against the Romans, conserving Jewish strength while maximizing their damage. The commanders were finally in a position to make a stand now that the defensive line had much smaller surface area than at the start of the siege, and this meant that the outnumbered Jews could far more readily concentrate forces and rebuff attacks. At this point, overall command of the defense had.
So the Jews commanded all of the blue areas, the Antonia Fortress, the Temple Mount, and the original city, the city of Herod right here, city of David, excuse me.
And granted to Simon, who held the first wall along the northern side up to the royal palace, and John's Galileans and Zealots held the Temple Mount and the Antonia Fortress on the eastern edge of the line. The legions advanced into the second city. Titus has dispatched the 10th and 15th legions to raise ramps in the west, where the second and the first walls met to the east, and he had the 5th and the 12th legions start construction against the Antonia Fortress. And they did so under incessant sorties and missile attacks. Historians tell us that the Jewish forces at this point have been able to bring up bear about 300 bolt throwers and 40 stone throwers from the rebels' armory. This firepower was considerable and must have forced the Romans to build their own protective countermeasures. On the 29th of May, now look at the time on that. On the 29th of May, right? So keep this in mind. We're already in May, and something hasn't happened yet. Yes, you're going to see that's happen in just a moment. They're going to end it. They're going to, because they get defeated over here with their siege towers and stuff, the Romans kind of get demoralized, okay? And Titus has them build a wall all the way around Jerusalem, because what was happening at this time? You know what's happening at the end of May? At the 50-day count? What's harvest? What if I told you it's ready to be harvested? And they had it available at this time. This barley. And so what are they doing? Obviously, they're going out of the city in the cover of night, and they're going and harvesting barley at this time. The 29th day of May, after 17 days, intense labor and nonstop harassment, The Romans completed their attack pass up to the eastern and western flanks, battering, ram siege towers, and numerous cohorts were brought up for all-out assault. However, unbeknownst to the Romans, the Jewish forces had been hard at work themselves, and they had secretly constructed sapling operations with a tunnel traveling under the first wall right up to the siege ramp. And against the Antonio excavations were supported by pit props, which the Jews set up as the fire took its course. So they set a fire. They did a tunnel and set a fire right under the siege ramps, right? Which caused a huge chasm to open up, engulfing the ramps and their siege engines. That was ingenious, right? Fires, which temporarily smothered, erupted once more as the bitumen reignited and burned which remained of the equipment. The Romans had once again fatally underestimated the defenders and were reaping the consequences. To the west, Simon did night attacks on the siege works in his sector of the battlefield. Brave rebels beat back resistance and fought their way into the ramps, setting their sheds alight. The fires alarmed the legionaries, who saw their hard work going up in smoke and rushed in to try to pull the rams out of harm's way. They were met by Jewish reinforcements streaming out of the posture and the gates, and a pitched battle ensued. A deadly tug-of-war followed over the rams, and the rebels finally managing to complete their destruction. Demoralized Romans pulled back. Sensing an opportunity, the Jewish forces swarmed out of the city in pursuit, driving the legions all the way back into their camp. Retreat was stabilized once again, and Titus rode to the rescue with his cavalry, and fierce fighting ensued, but the rebels were finally pushed back to the first wall. Roman siege lines were in shambles. Virtually all of their rams and ramps were smoldering and ruined by morning. And the morale of the legions must have been in a similar state. It was approaching the hottest part of the year. Now, water was running low, and building material was becoming increasingly hard. Now, the hottest part of the year, think about that. So we're getting into the dry season, right? There's still latter rains that happen in the dry season, in between crops, right? So we're at the end of May, the barley's ready. Okay, we got some ways to go, right? Anyway, things were hard to come by at this point. Watch what Titus does. Nonetheless, Titus launched an ambitious plan to restore the spirit and security of the men. His plan called for the construction of an 8-kilometer wall of circumvallating forts. There was 13 forts to do this. He leveraged the proud nature of the troops by having the legions and the cohorts challenge one another for the honor of being the first to complete the allotted portion of the wall. Relatively safe from Jewish attacks, the legionaries were free to reforge their unit cohesion through competitive labor, and the result was a stunning success. Within 3 days, the entire structure was completed. Morale amongst the Romans was restored. All the Jews were left stunned, and a sign that the Romans' war machine wasn't backing down. If anything, had just shifted into high gear. Previously, citizens had been able to slip out at night to collect supplies from the countryside. Remember what I just said? Before the wall, right? So at 50 days, they were able to go out and get barley. But now they can no longer go out because now they're gonna be in trouble if they do. Nobody's allowed to they're killing people left and right. So they went out at night to collect supplies up to this point. But now this proved impossible. Any rebels caught outside the walls were crucified as a terrifying example of Rome's wrath, while even those who defected willingly were often gutted by troops who believed their stomachs to be filled with precious items ingested for concealment. Inside, the food situation rapidly deteriorated. The defenders were reduced to eating pets and boiling hay, and even disturbing reports mention, for instance, of infantile cannibalism taking place. Now, in the 10th week of the siege, think about that, 10 weeks. We come to 10 weeks now. Where does that put us? 10 weeks of the siege. Now we're up to, listen, we're completely surrounded by a wall that was constructed in 3 days. And all this is under Roman control. Now we're coming in through the Antonio fortress into this. All the timing of this is incredible, folks. On the 10th week of the siege, Titus orders all forces to concentrate their assault on the Antonio fortress. The full-scale assault began with the mobilization of archers and artillery to suppress the walls, while 2 battering rams moved into position and men armed with crowbars took aim at the foundation blocks of the towers. Efforts made the first day, Romans were forced to withdraw for the night without making any noticeable gains. Unbeknownst to both sides, however, the heavy activity in the area took a toll on the structural stability of the fortress. The mine, which had been previously brought the Roman siege rams down, also undermined the Antonio with a heavy rain combined with pressure of the men and machinery at work provided the straw that broke the camel's back. In the dead of night, the northern wall of the fortress collapsed. Talk about an act of God, right? At first light, the Romans positioned themselves for a direct assault through the breach. Once again, however, the Jews were one step ahead and had already constructed another secondary wall on the other side. Unwilling to give up the nighttime gift, Titus asked for volunteers to tackle the fortifications head on. A handful of brave men volunteered, no doubt encouraged by the promise of rich reward. This gang took heavy fire as they ran up the barricade, but managed to scramble over the top, and the attackers proved to be too few with no reinforcements on the way and were inevitably slaughtered. The failure of this mission in full sight of the Roman army sapped all their will to fight, and attempting to stalemate ensued. 2 days later, in the early morning, 2 days later, in the early morning, 24 enterprising Romans, including a standard bearer from the 5th Macedon and a trumpeter, decided to attack on their own initiative. The men silently climbed the ruins of the Antonian fortress and slit the throats of the sentries with the barricade now secure. The trumpeter sounded a signal. This blast within the walls threw the Jews into a panic as they jolted awake from their sleep, imagining that the entire Roman army was upon them. They fled into the Temple Mount. Meanwhile, the Roman command was equally confused, but knew something had to be done. Titus, along with his officers, picked men from the units and immediately sent them toward the sound of the trumpet. When the Jews realized that the Romans were not hot on their heels, cooler heads prevailed, and they rallied militias and streamed at the courtyard, as it soon became apparent that the real Roman forces were now certainly to be on their way. If they gained a foothold in the sanctuary, all was lost. Both sides realized that this was the case and plunged into the darkness towards the passages linking the Antonio to the Temple Mount. Brutal fighting in the close quarter confines and that dragged on for nearly 10 hours. In the fury of the Jews, fed by constant reinforcements, prevailed over the Romans, who sounded the retreat and thus ending the first battle of the temple. All right. Titus ordered the men to raise the Antonio on his side of the battle lines, and within a week was ready to renew the attack. 7,200 legionaries picked from 30 of the best troops from each century were mustered at night on July 17th. Now think about that. July 17th, where we are in the count, okay? Remember, Shavuot is the last part of the fourth month, all right? July 17th, these men silently shuffled toward the ruins of the Antonio for a surprise attack. Jewish sentries, however, picked up on the advance and sounded the alarm. In some areas, Roman forces were able to cut their way past the previous week's high water mark. However, in the obscurity of the night, close chaos reigned. This was made even worse by the fact that the rebels had equipped themselves with captured Roman gear, to the point that many legionaries and Jewish units ended up bumping into and fighting friendly forces. The combat was so confused that it proved virtually impossible to capitalize on any gains either side made. When the sun eventually began to rise, some degree of order was finally restored. Josephus reports that both sides now separated and drew up into the ragged battle lines at the edges of the sanctuary's northern edge. Missiles began to fly, and a savage pitched battle developed. Titus attempted to orchestrate and organize attack, but the tight confines again rendered this futile. By midday, it became apparent that no gains would be made, and the second battle of the temple was called off. Now think about that. They're in basically, this is like an arena. There's nowhere to go except these porticos, right? This whole area is just nothing but a bloody battlefield, hand-to-hand combat. Feeling it would be impossible to punch a hole through the Jewish bottleneck, Titus thus resolved to broaden the scale of the attack. In the peak of the summer heat, he ordered 4 more ramps to be built against the northwestern corner of the Temple Mount. In response, the Jews massed their missiles at the walls and sent forth continuous waves of skirmishers and sorties to harass the workers. Nonetheless, the legions steadily made progress. With the works nearing completion, the defenders tore down the northwestern corner of the temple colonnade, severing connection between the defensive parapets and the remaining elements of the Antonio. This effectively removed a key avenue of the Romans, hoping to be used as an attack route. At the same time, a major sortie was attempting against the Roman wall at the Mount of Olives.
All right, I want to point out here at the same time, because they're still doing, by the way, they're fighting in the courtyard. They are still doing the daily sacrifice. And now, because we're in summer, they have got to go out and get wheat. But they can't, because the Romans have built a wall all the way around the city. But you see that the Hebrews attempt to go out. Why are they going there? They're going out to pick a fight. They're fighting in the temple. Why would they go out right here? They're going out because they're trying to get to the wheat, because they got to keep Shavuot, and they're missing it.
It's true. Though that's successful, this is all once again attested to the boldness of the defenders. A cornered beast. All right, look, now imagine they got the swall up. They're running out of grain in there, and all they've had is barley. They can't get the wheat that the Romans have control of the wheat, and they're not letting these guys get it. The Romans are eating it, right? Making bread of it. So their defenders are coming out to try, because they're like a cornered beast. Certainly a force to be reckoned. On the 27th of July, look, we're coming to the end of July. We're getting really close to the new moon, but separating, going into the month of Av, right? The 9th of Av, the 10th of Av is when the temple's destroyed. We're getting real close, right? So in the time of Shavuot, you guys, they're breaching the wall and coming into the courtyard.
And yet they're still trying to keep the feast at the same time. They're still trying to keep that feast because they know it's a feast time in the temple. The priests are still hard at work. They're trying to keep this at the appropriate time, but at the same time, they got defenders that are defending the northwestern breach point, right? They're in trouble.
Right? Really close to the which is going to be the exact day that Moses came down and they were worshiping the cow. And look what's happening. The temple's about to be destroyed.
For the second time.
They ran up against the broken end of the Western colonies, spotted an opportunity. It appeared that the Jewish activity on the other fronts had caused a withdrawal of the defensive forces in the area. The legions rushed forward with ladders for an immediate assault by the escalade. Hundreds of troops now swarmed into the undefended walls, with many more following behind it. However, the Jewish retreat had been a trap. In the previous days, they had secretly filled the rafters with dry wood and bitumen, which they now set alight, and the entire sector of the wall burst into flames, with the Roman assault troops caught in the inferno. This occurred inside both armies and provided a tremendous morale boost to the defenders. The Romans proved wary. Another assault, and instead tried to breach the walls with rams and picks. For days, they worked around the clock in relays to undermine the defensive fortifications. They did so under a continuous bombardment of missiles and harassment. Eventually, several huge blocks were pried loose, but the thick construction of the Temple Mount defiled all attempts at destruction. Titus must have been unimaginably frustrated. Desperate for results, he ordered another storming of the walls. The results were predictably bloody. Roman troops climbing the ladders were dangerously exposed. Many found themselves toppled in their attempts to scale the wall, while others finally managed to reach the top under continual artillery and archer covering fire, only to be left isolated. Those that did make it were vastly outnumbered and slaughtered. Roman centurions resorted to throwing legionary eagles onto the walls in a bid to motivate the proud soldiers to retrieve them. However, even this desperate measure proved fruitless and only resulted in the death of even more bull-headed attackers. The increasingly costly assault was abandoned. Rather than abandon all hope, Titus made preparations for yet another attack on the temple at the beginning of August. The objective would be to finally push through the bottleneck at the Antonio and move out into the open spaces of the courtyard, where the legions would gain the necessary space to fight effectively archers and artillery were massed in and around the ruins of the Antonia. These began to target the defender as holding out at the north end of the temple complex. Once they had cleared, the Roman troops burnt out and tore down the entire northern colonnade, and this would allow the attackers to deploy along the entire width of the plaza, but at the same time stripping away the crucial Jewish defensive position. While the northern battlements were now destroyed, sight lines were opened up and into the other flanking battlement positions. The defenders stationed here found themselves dangerously exposed and were forced to pull back, and the Jewish line of defense was reformed and now cut across the center of the temple mount, with the temple itself serving as a central bastion. It is around this time that the greatest of all ill omens took place. This is the spiritual crisis involved in the daily sacrifice of the lamb to Yahweh. Like clockwork, the priest had upheld the holy right of time amidst the bloodshed and starvation of the siege, but on the 5th of August, the last of the sacrificial lambs ran out. At the height of the siege, the Romans advancing, the Jews lost their connection to God. Now the stage was set for a fight over the very heart of Jerusalem, and the Temple Mount, left at the end of the ragged Jewish line, was stationed on the western gate with access to the upper city. The right flank was anchored on the opposite side of the colonnade at Solomon's portico. The center of the line ran through the temple and its inner court, and the Romans held the north, and the Jews held the south. Both sides were prepared for a fateful duel within the enormous gladiatorial arena that was the Temple Mount complex. In the center of the battlefield was the linchpin of the Jewish defenses, inner temple. Just like the Temple Mount, the temple was surrounded by all the high fighting platforms atop a series of perimeter colonnades. The eastern half of the compound was known as the Court of Women, and this was then connected to the western half of another wall, and the Corinthian gate on the other side lay the court of the Israelites, and beyond that the court of the priest, and at the very end by the Holy of Holies. A 45-meter tall white marble edifice adorned with enormous golden gates and topped by golden points. This was said to be the very house of God, in which only the high priest entered on the Day of Atonement, and in fact, the entire inner temple was normally off limits to all but a select few. Extraordinary circumstances, however, call for extraordinary measures, and the holy space is packed with defenders. Despite being exhausted and on the verge of starvation, the Jews attacked at dawn on August 9th. Troops burst out of the eastern gate and rushed Roman lines in force, and the surprised legions reeled, but managed to hold their ground once more. Titus and his cavalry mount up and charged across the open ground. A small group of horses crashed into the Jewish mob, sending shockwaves through the mass of men. However, the attack failed to dissuade the rebels, and the third battle of the temple began. This engagement was categorized by a confused series of attack and counterattacks along the eastern end of the sanctuary. The Jewish defenders offered supporting fire from atop the nearby temple rooftops, while Roman counterparts did the same from their own rear lines. Imagine that, right? So we just came through Shavuot, right? We're on the other side of Shavuot now. Bloodshed going on. They never even got to celebrate Shavuot. Fighting raged on for several hours before subsiding into an uneasy stalemate. The following day, August 10th, the Jews again launched an attack on the Romans holding the outer court, initiating the fourth battle of the temple. The engagement was similarly hard fought, but the crush of a Roman counterattack managed to drive the defenders right up to the temple walls itself. Jews atop the walls dislodged stones and threw down an assortment of projectiles onto the Romans. However, in a close press, a pair of legionaries were seized by impulse. One grabbed a piece of flaming debris, while the other hoisted him up against the north side of the temple, and from this elevation he lobbed burning timber through a low golden door into the sanctuary chambers, and in the summer heat, the highly flammable timbers and the textiles ignited in a thick black smoke billowed into the air as the fire spread rapidly to stun amazement of both sides. The fire rapidly spiraled out of control, threatening to consume the countless sacred texts and treasures within the temple. The Jews were left paralyzed between choosing to fight the flames or the Romans. But the legion seized on the initiative and plunged forward without orders, and they battered down the eastern gates and penetrated the inner court of the temple. And in this moment, at the climax of the grueling 3-month siege, the attackers gave way to their beast unit. Anyway, they broke through on this day. It was on the 10th day of you guys. They broke through. The temple is on fire. And by the way, once it gets on fire, all the gold leaf and the silver leaf that encrusts on everything, every surface on the inside, is melting and going down into the cracks of the temple, right? And this is part of the plunder. And so these soldiers start going crazy, right? All right, so only by a toxic psychological state of repressed rage and frustration, pity was the first casualty, soon followed by a butchery of all those who did not flee the hellscape. The young, the old, the helpless, all were put to the sword, and this bloodlust would only be matched in the intensity by greed. Roman soldiers plunged into the flaming complex, intent on making off with the treasures inside. The frenzy reached a fever pitch where the Roman troops are being trampled to death by their comrades. The arrival of Titus seemed to have little effect on the state of the men, and this was often a natural occurrence in the final stages of a siege, when even the ablest of commanders could do nothing to restrain the wild passions of soldiers. Eventually, the delirium subsided, and when the temple was picked clean, both men and flame chants of Imperator, Imperator, Imperator greeted Titus as he ordered the sacrifice of an ox, a sheep, and a pig at the eastern gate of the temple. With this move, he consummated the dominion of the Roman gods over, or the domination of the Roman gods over the Jews. Imagine that. He sacrificed all those animals and establishes the domination of the Roman gods over the Jews. And what did we just celebrate? We just celebrated the feast. And by the way, so I'm not going to go through this whole thing, because the point was the destruction of the temple. The temple has now been destroyed. Now the Roman forces moves into the cities and basically burns and kills everything in sight, and fights all the way over here to Herod's palace, right? So I'm kind of summarizing now. The point was what happens here. All of this killing here continues on into the next feast, the 7th month. We're talking about Sukkot and Yom Teruah, then Yom Kippur, and then Sukkot. So from beginning all the way at Passover time, going through Pentecost, the 50 days, and then the real Shavuot, and then all the way to the elder feast, it's been nothing but killing from feast to feast to feast. And the worst happening at the end of the fourth month, going into the month of Av, the destruction of the temple. Now you start to see why the Jews have an issue with Shavuot, because this is the second time it's happened, folks. The destruction of the second temple happened at the same time the first one did.
And then you have all the things that have happened since the destruction of the second temple, going all the way down to the modern age. Folks, if you go online and look at what's happened every 9th of Av, a significant date happens to Jews, it's a bad time for them. It's a bad time. It's very much what I said. Like, if you can imagine all of your family being killed at Christmas time, chances are every Christmas that follows, you're probably not celebrating that holiday, right? So with the Jews and Shavuot being attributed to the destruction of the temple, you're probably not really wanting to celebrate that, especially if God commanded you to be joyful. And every feast is connected to joy and thankfulness and being generous and loving your neighbor. So you're commanded to be joyous in these feast times. What happens if it's a time of mourning? You can't be both, right? They can't be celebrating a time of mourning and then, in the breach of the original wall, because they start this thing called Tisha B'Av at the 17th of Tammuz, which is right before the destruction of temple. So you're mourning all the way up until Shavuot time, and then mourning even more after Shavuot time, like another week, another 10 days. You can't have a time of joy in the middle of a time of mourning. And so what do? That's the answer, folks. They no longer keep they no longer keep Shavuot in its correct day. They move it to the end of the barley harvest. That way they can still be joyous, but also mourn. That's what they did, folks. And so now we're going into the next section of this video, and we're going to talk about Tisha B'Av. So now we're at a time called Tisha B'Av, which is like I said, is a time of mourning. You will not find this in the Torah or anything a part of the feast days, nor will you find anything about the counting of the Omer. For that fact, this is all Talmudic and rabbinic tradition. Now, what I've just shown you with the count, where it brings us to the actual count, the significant things that have happened on that day, and then what happened with not only the first temple with the Babylonians, but also the second temple. And it happened in a critical time where the Jews have been in a revolt for a long time, and this was building up. This was coming to a head. It was already at a boiling point when Yeshua was on the scene, and here 40 years later with the destruction of the temple and the fulfillment of Yeshua's prophecy about no stone unturned, right? So when the fire happened, it didn't destroy, in other words, all the stones come down, and that's how all the stones are. That came after, when they were looking through the cracks of the stones to get down in the floor to get all the gold. That's when they started pushing all the stones off of the mountain. So I want to go now to Amos 8, because this is something that Yah revealed to me during this study. I clearly heard the Holy Spirit, say, go to Amos 8, and this is what I find here. Now consider everything that we've seen. This is the 8th chapter of Amos, and it says, thus says Yah Adonai Elohim thus hath Adonai Elohim showed me, and behold, a summer basket of fruit. And he said, Amos, what seest thou? And I said, a basket of summer fruit. And he said, and then said Yah unto me, the end is coming upon my people Israel. I will not pass again by them any more. And the songs of the temple shall be howlings in that day, saith Yahuwah Elohim. There shall be many dead bodies in every place, and they shall cast them forth with silence. Hear this, O ye that swallow up the needy, to make the poor of the land to fall, saying, when will the new moon be gone, that we may sell corn, and the Sabbath, that we may set forth wheat, making the ephah small and the shekel great, and falsifying the balances of deceit, that we may buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of shoes, yea, and sell the refuse of the wheat. The Adonai had sworn by the excellency of Jacob, surely I will never forget their works. Shall not the land tremble for this, and every one mourn that dwelleth therein? Mourn. And it shall rise up wholly as a flood, and it shall be cast out and drowned as a flood of Egypt. And it shall come to pass in that day, saith Yah, that I will cause the sun to go down at noon, and will darken the earth in clear day. And I will turn your feasts into mourning, and your songs unto lamentations. Now, what I've found out is that sometimes a few hundred years, it wasn't immediately, it was a few hundred years after the destruction of the temple, when there's no longer a priesthood. This is when the counting of the Omers started. What they did was they moved the real Shavuot to the 50-day count, where Yah comes down and gives the Torah orally, instead of where it was where Moses comes down with the tablets and he has to break them, because that's where it is originally. So what they did was they moved that day to the end of the barley harvest and celebrate that as the first fruits. And I showed you in the video with Dr. Michael Brown, what are they doing to this day? They're baking barley and waving barley at the 50-day count. There is no wheat, there is no new wine. And what does it say? I will turn your feasts into mourning and all your songs into lamentation. So what happens is, at that time, when the wall that Titus put up, so they cut them off from the getting out and foraging, all they had on the inside was barley. They could not get the wheat from that point. The Romans had it locked down. Do you know what they do on Tisha B'Av? One of the things that they do is they sit on the floor and they read the book of Lamentations. It is a feast of mourning. It's 3 weeks, starting at the 17th of Tammuz and running all the way through to the 10th of Av, which right in the middle of that is Shavuot. Now, we are commanded to be joyful at all of Yah's feast. That would include Shavuot. We're supposed to be joyful at that. So the rabbis found themselves in a bad conundrum, because they can't celebrate a joyous feast and be in a state of mourning at the same time, in the same season. So that's why they moved the day to the 50-day mark. And it transferred it. The cascading effects of this is that the Christians adopted it. Instead of following what the actual text says, 7 Sabbaths complete and 50 days. It just become 50. Okay. Anyway, this prophecy came to pass, and the rabbis recognized that. And you see that Yah had told them he was going to turn their feast time into mourning. And so what they did was, now they accept that Yah has turned it into mourning, and they moved Shavuot to another time, so that they're not doing both at the same time, okay? And this would be, this time of year for them, like I said earlier, would be like your whole family got killed at a special holiday. and then you no longer want to keep that holiday because it's so traumatic to you. It's the same thing with the Jewish people, with this whole thing. And it's not just the destruction of the temple, it's everything that happened all through history on the 9th of Av that's happened. They were expelled from Spain, Spain, and Great Britain in the same time, 9th of Av, in many different years apart, and not in the same year, by the way. This was years later, and then years later, and then years later, all in the same week. That's not a coincidence. That is a bad omen to the Jews, and therefore they to this day they commemorate it with something called Tisha B'Av. And in this time, like I said, there's no traveling. They don't shave their beards. Some of them don't bathe or brush their teeth. There's a lot of fasting. It's a time of mourning, and there's definitely no joy, no marriages, none those kinds of things are out at that time. And they believe when the Messiah comes, that is going to be changed. He is going to turn it from mourning back to joy. And so they see Tisha B'Av as a temporary thing. Okay, so I did find this online. This is Torah.com. So this was a Jewish source here that was kind of interesting. I'll put a link down below with all the resources that I've used in this video, and you can go and read it for yourself. All about the temple destroyed on the 10th of Av, right? Jerusalem was burned. There were over 1 million that died, and it's turned into now a feast of mourning. That's what happened, folks. Interesting read here. I would encourage you to go look at it. I want to take you to one more thing, actually two more. Very short history of Tisha B'Av, and then something really interesting that I found that just come up in my feed in this study, where the very first thing that comes out of this woman, amazing what comes out of her mouth, is just another witness. So here's what he says.
Every major ancient holiday on the Jewish calendar, even Yom Kippur, is ultimately about joy, except for one, Tisha B'Av. On this day, the 9th of the Hebrew month of Av, it's said that a series of major tragedies to the Jewish people occurred, including the destruction of the first and second temples. It's a day of mourning for getting kicked out of the land of Israel, for the destruction of Jerusalem, and the medieval expulsions from various lands. It's said that Tisha B'Av is the day when it all went down, literally. Sacred sites, entire communities utterly destroyed, leaving a gaping hole in our collective soul. When life comes crashing down, we're left devastated. We cry, we mourn, we feel isolated. All natural responses to loss. Tisha B'Av is a day of mourning when the Jewish people acknowledge that no, life is not all butterflies and roses. And yes, this tribe has been through some serious suffering. The time prior to this day is known as the 3 weeks.
21 days of mourning.
On the 17th of Tammuz, when the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE began, and intensifies during the last 9 days, when the walls were breached until the 9th of Av, when the ancient temple fell.
And I was going to point out that Shavuot is right in the middle of that time.
The whole period is somber, and it's customary not to hold weddings during this time. Traditional Jews stop shaving, cutting their hair, and listening to music. During the 9 days, some also refrain from eating meat and drinking alcohol. The final day is Tisha B'Av, a 24-hour fast. In the evening, it's common to sit on low stools or the floor at synagogue and to hear the book of Ahab, Lamentations, chanted by candlelight. The book, traditionally ascribed to Jeremiah, brings readers on a graphic journey of the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. Silent sit on the ground the elders of fair Zion. They have strewn dust on their heads and girded themselves with sackcloth. The maidens of Jerusalem have bowed their heads to the ground. My eyes are spent with tears, my heart is in tumult. My being melts away over the ruin of my poor people, as babes and sucklings languish in the squares of the city. Melodies of the day are like a dirge, a time of reflection as Lamentations concludes, Hashivenu Adonai, turn us to you, Holy One, and we will return. Renew us as before. Following the reading, it's customary not to greet each other and to leave in silence, honoring the lives lost in the sacred space of introspection. When a dark history seems to follow an entire people around, it's only natural to ask why, or how could this be? Sometimes these questions are real, and sometimes they're more like a lament. Why me? Why us? How could this have happened? Echa translates literally to how, as in, how could this be? Jewish thinkers have struggled to understand these questions for thousands of years. Historians see these as historical events where one nation overpowered another, but the rabbis understood them differently. In Hebrew, sinat chinam, baseless or useless hatred, was rampant throughout the land. The rabbinic tradition understood the loss of Jerusalem and the temple to be the divine consequence of the people's unethical behavior. That's why this day is also a time to consider improving our own words and actions in the world, especially how we treat others. Tisha B'Av comes in the midst of summer and yanks people out of that summertime and the living is easy feeling.
Show you a basket of summer fruit. Okay. You guys, Shabbat is a summer, or it was. It is now a hidden day. It has been hidden and lost because of the destruction of the temple. And by the way, this is the Jewish history. This is not our history, as in followers of Yeshua, because we see it differently. Me coming out of the Pentecostal church, being raised in the Pentecostal church, I understand that day and the significance of what happened there. Even though I don't believe in that doctrine, I do believe that the Holy Spirit was poured out on everyone in that time. And I do believe that it was Shavuot time, and I do believe it is the time when Moses came down with the tablets, and that the Jews, the believers at that time also knew this. And eventually it became a day of mourning because of the Jews, not because of the believers of Yeshua. It still is a joyous day. We're supposed to be joyous at all of Yah's feast. But again, man-made traditions come in. Should we be counting the Omer? Should we be observing Tisha B'Av? And by the way, they believe that this will be the case until the Messiah comes and the temple is rebuilt, and that day is going to be reversed back to a joyous time. Okay, everybody follow? That's what it's become, folks. That's what it's become. This is something interesting that came across my feed, where this Orthodox lady here has a channel. And she's talking about the 3 weeks, because the 3 weeks starting from the 17th of Tammuz running all the way to Tisha B'Av is called the 3 weeks. And I want you to hear what she says about this. One of the very first things she says.
Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Hannah and this is Jar of Fireflies. Here I make videos all about my life as an Orthodox Jewish homeschooling mother of 4. And today, I'll be sharing with you about the 3 weeks. So right now is a time in the Jewish calendar called the 3 weeks. And this is the time of mourning for all of the Jewish people. So there's a lot of things that I'm doing a little bit differently right now. And I'll be explaining what all of this means in today's video. So the 3 weeks is a time of mourning for all of the Jewish people, and it starts on the Hebrew calendar Jewish date of the 17th of Tammuz. This year, that was July 6th. It reaches its conclusion on the 9th of the Jewish month of Av, which is later this week if you're watching this video the day that it comes out. There are a lot of mourning-related customs that we as a Jewish people follow during the entire 3-week period. For example, we're not buying new clothing, we're not cutting our hair, and we're not listening to music. The music thing, definitely a challenge for most people that I know. For me, I switched to listening to a lot of podcasts instead, a lot of Torah classes online, and nature sounds, which is quite relaxing. Okay, so starting at the beginning, at the 17th of Tammuz, this is a fast day for the Jewish people. It's considered a minor fast day, so we are only fasting from dawn until nightfall. The fast commemorates 5 tragic events that occurred on this date. The first event is when Moses came down and saw the people worshiping the golden calf, and he broke the tablet.
The very first thing they're commemorating during this time, and I don't agree with it. I don't think that was the 17th of Tammuz. That was toward the end of the month, closer to the end of the month. However, the very first thing that she says that we are commemorating this for is when Moses came down with the tablets and broke them.
Another event that we are commemorating is when Apostomos burned a Torah. There's a debate about which Torah scroll exactly this was. Regardless, it's a bad thing, and we are mourning that. Apostomos was, by the way, a Greek officer. Another event that we are commemorating is when idols were placed in the Holy Temple. Another event is during the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem, when there were not enough sheep and we had to cease making sacrifices, our daily sacrifices at the Holy Temple.
Same thing happened under Titus. They had to cease and they could no longer do it. And it got bad there. They were resulting to some bad things and even cannibalism.
And finally, in the year 69 CE, the walls of Jerusalem were breached by the Romans. This was after a lengthy siege, and the Romans were on their way to destroy the temple. The final 9 days of this 3-week period is a pretty intense time of mourning for us. For the final 9 days from the 1st of Av until the 9th of Av, we take on additional mourning practices. For example, we don't do laundry, we don't drink wine, and we don't eat meat. On Shabbat, however, we are still allowed to drink wine and eat meat. And then finally, we reach the 9th of Av. The 9th of Av is a major fast on the Jewish calendar, and it is a longer fast. So it's
a major fast to the Jews, and it's something that is rabbinic. And you can see all those books right there. They're Sephardic. This Sephardic Orthodox. You can tell by the books they have. So this would be like what she's talking about. What I've been talking about when I'm talking about the Talmud. That's what the Talmud would look like. It's many books, okay, and it's rabbis making rulings and things like that. Anyway, we got a new day, or we've had a new day for over 2,000 years. They've been keeping this. So the Romans had a lot to do with it. It forced them into this new age without a priesthood. Now they moved into a more exclusively Talmudic rabbinic tradition. It was even happening in the time of Yeshua. They had the Babylonian Talmud, and from when they were in exile in Babylon, and which infiltrated into the temple system. But now that there's no temple, now they've moved into exclusively the rabbis call the shots, and it wasn't too longer after that where they had to make a universal calendar for everybody, all the Jews that were in diaspora. There was no longer a priesthood to call and tell them when the time was, when the new months were, all those kinds of things. And so that's when they went on a Roman calendar, folks. And I just put that video last week for my class. That conversation about how the Roman calendar, how the Jews got on a Roman calendar, it was by force. And even to this day, they're locked into it. So a lot to unravel. This was going down all these rabbit holes, and then it all started with the counting of the Omer for me, trying to figure out why they started doing this. And I kept hearing, oh, it's to commemorate the destruction of the Second Temple. Well, that's part of it. The way they do the barley, it has a lot to do with what happened in the temple, and that's why they're doing that. But the Shavuot part of it, and the Tisha B'Av, that is another facet of this. That's, by the way, going to be undone and reversed at some point when the Messiah gets here, is what the Jews believe. So that's what I got for you on this, you guys. Shavuot is not at 50 days. It was originally changed. And what I mean by that is it says what it says in Leviticus, but it could be interpreted a number of ways. The Jews, after this tragedy, only started doing 50. And so for all the onlookers, especially the Christians, this must be the status quo. And so those of us who interpret it differently look like a crazy person, especially when you prove that there is no wheat, there's no new wine, and all the other witnesses that are, a part of this. At some point, one has to consider all these things and say, what's really going on here? All right. So we got to be really careful with man-made traditions, especially things that are adopted and carried over from Judaism or even Catholicism, because Christianity is loaded with Catholic traditions. A good example is the Eucharist or communion. Okay. So folks, if you learned something from this, please comment down below. Let me know, please. If you could share this video. If you could help with a donation, I would appreciate that as well. Folks, just at that time of year where things are getting kind of tight again. So let me know what you think. Let's talk about it down below. If you have disagreements or if I've missed something, let me know down below. Shalom to you. May y'all bless you. We'll see you in the next one.